Good evening, friends. I think we should start our discussion. My name is Volodymyr Sklokin, and I will be the moderator of this meeting tonight. Thank you for having found the time and joining us here at the Center for Urban History. The talk is entitled "The Long Shadows of the Past, Ukraine and Russia in the Light of the Soviet Totalitarian Experience." And we will today be talking to our guest visiting here from the United States, Professor Hiroaki Kuromiya. Thank you very much, Professor, for being with us today. And to begin with, I would like to briefly introduce Professor Kuromiya. I will just say a few words about his intellectual biography. Hiroaki Kuromiya was born in Japan and studied at the University of Tokyo, which he graduated from in 1979. After this, he moved to the United States, where he started his PhD studies at Princeton, and his dissertation was dedicated to the first five-year plan and the situation of the workers. He defended this at Princeton in 1985. Based on this dissertation, 3 years later, in 1988, he published his first book entitled Stalin's Industrial Revolution, Policy and Workers. It came out in Cambridge University Press. And after the conclusion of his doctoral studies, Hiroaki Kuromiya studied at Cambridge, and King's College, Cambridge, in England, and also at the Center for Russian Studies at Harvard. In 1990, he started teaching history at the University of Indiana, Bloomington, and he continues in that position to this day. After completing his studies of Stalin's Industrial Revolution, he started working on a study of one of the regions of the Soviet Union, perhaps most full with workers, and certainly this is true for Soviet Ukraine. And he's writing on the Donbass region. After many years of study, he wrote his Freedom and Terror in Donbass, the Ukrainian-Russian borderland, which came out in 1998, also in Cambridge University Press. 4 years later, in 2002, the book was translated into Ukrainian by the Osnowy publisher. Then his next publication was a biography of Joseph Stalin, which came out in English in 2005, and later in 2009, Voices of the Dead, Stalin's Great Terror of the 1930s, came out, also by Professor Kuromiya, in which he tried to reconstruct the views and biographies of the victims of Stalin's terror in Soviet Ukraine. That same year in Toruń, together with Adam Gabonski, Professor Kuromiya published a book on the cooperation of the Polish and Japanese intelligence in the 1930s and 40s. It was published in Polish, and finally his latest book, called The Judgment of Conscience, the fate of 14 pacifists in Stalin's Ukraine, which was dedicated to the fate of the reformist Adventist in Bila Cerkva, who were condemned in 1953 for anti-Soviet propaganda and insubordination to Soviet laws. This was also published in English in 2012. We see a very broad spectrum of interest, of scholarly interest in Professor Kuromiya, encompassing both Soviet history and the phenomenon of Stalinism and the history of Ukraine and the history of the Donbass region. So today we'll try to make use of Professor Kuromiya's long, extensive experience and knowledge in the study of Soviet Union and Ukraine, and we will try to talk about what Soviet society was like, what was the role of terror and repression in the functioning of this society, and what is the influence of this of this heritage of Soviet totalitarianism in today's Ukraine and Russia. Now, I would like from the get-go to stress that we will try not to touch on the Donbass as such, although this is the DonKult festival. Professor Kuromiya has already given us, 3 days ago, he's already given us a talk dedicated to the problems of the Donbass as such. And this lecture, if those of you who have not seen it, it was taped and it will be available on the Center for Urban History website. So today we'll try to talk about broader subjects. We will try to touch upon, we will try to talk about Soviet Union, the Soviet Ukraine today, Ukraine and Russia today. Of course, Donbass can be present in this, as a backdrop in this discussion. And we have about an hour and a half, because we have a whole number of events that follow each other. So I would like to start this conversation by asking the first few questions, or setting the first few themes, after which we, the room will be, the floor will be able to join and join the discussion and put the questions that that might interest you. Now, this is where I'll switch into English. For those of you who have trouble understanding, you can use your interpretation devices. Professor Kuromiya will, of course, speak in English today.
Well, I'm switching into English. So, you have been studying Soviet history for almost 40 years now, and frankly speaking, for me and for people of my generation, and even younger, it's something which is very difficult to imagine. And you were born, but let's start from the beginning. Yes, you were born in Japan, you studied at the university there, then you moved to the US and completed your graduate education at Princeton University. But both your MA thesis and doctoral dissertation were devoted to the Soviet history, to the first 5-year plan and Stalin's industrialization. So I want to ask you, why did you choose Soviet history as your topic? Why did you think that it was important or interesting then? Why didn't you become a student of Japanese history, for example, which would have been a more predictable career for you?
Hello? Yes. Well, I'm getting older, so I'm going back a bit to my origins. I'm doing a lot of work in Asia, in Japan, China, and last week I was in Mongolia, so I was traveling a lot. But I think there are a number of reasons. I always tell that Japan is a neighbor of Russia, of the Soviet Union. In that sense, yes, Russia, the Soviet Union was always very close to my consciousness. And my own grandfather, my paternal grandfather, whom I never met because he died well before I was born, was an officer in the Japanese army, which fought the Russo-Japanese War in Manchuria. So I've heard about that story from my father. And then the third factor is the fact that in my village, I grew up in the countryside, in a very remote countryside, where there were many returnees from Soviet Gulag, because in 1945, when the war ended, the Soviets captured about 500,000–600,000 Japanese as, well, not POWs, they captured, interned them, and used them as a labor force. And quite a few also ended up in Ukraine. I think in the Donbass too, there were some internees. And by 1956, most of them came back, 20 or 30,000 people died, but most of them survived and came back, and of course they were speaking some Russian, using Opsi was like math, Russian math. So there are always, Russia was in my mind all the time, but of course I was also interested in Ukraine, for I cannot trace my interest really, but somehow Ukraine had this romantic image of Cossacks or some, land of freedom. So I was always interested in Ukraine, but studying Ukrainian language, there was no possibility. No, I don't think any institution taught the Ukrainian language when I was a student. Now they do, I think. So certainly I took the Russian language, as well as other languages we had to study, and I was interested in. And when I look at the history of the world, the Soviet Union played a critical role. Without the Russian Revolution of 1917, the whole history of the world in the 20th century would have been completely different. Of course, we have to decide why the revolution took place. But without the Russian Revolution, World War II would not have happened, the Cold War would not have happened. In that sense, the Russian Revolution began what they call the short 20th century that ended World War I, or the Russian Revolution ended the short, long 19th century and started the short 20th century, which we say ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So yes, the presence of the Soviet Union was very close to me. I knew that it defined the 20th century, and I knew that it was different from the world in which I was born and grew up, which is post-war Japan. In other words, it's not militaristic, aggressive Japan, which was defeated in the war in 1945, and under American-British occupation, it changed a great deal, if not completely. So I knew that there was a different world out there, just next door. And of course, China, communist China, was also next door. So in that sense, communism was always in at least in my mind. And I just wanted to understand why this happened, whether it was a bad thing or good thing. I was relatively open-minded, because unlike the United States and Japan, there are all kinds of ideas going on, leftist, communist, socialist ideas, they're all over. No one really believes that they're a bad thing. It's part of intellectual life. So we read, of course, everything from classical Chinese to modern European philosophy, including Hegel, Marx, and Sartre, and all these continental philosophers as well. So somehow communism was there, Russia was there, something big, something like Russia, something like China, which were completely different, appeared to be completely different. These factors were there when I was growing up in Japan in the 1950s and 60s. So I thought, yes, this is something I wanted to study, although I was not always a good historian. History was badly taught, so I was more attracted to natural sciences like mathematics or physics, and then of course in Russia, in Ukraine, the Soviet Union, there are many good mathematicians and physicists. In Ukraine, of course, people like Landau, yes, the Kharkiv school, I'm sure there are people from Kharkiv. But in the end, if I recall my experience clearly, I started my college in the spring of 1972, which coincided with the escalation of the Vietnam War, in which, of course, the United States played a major role, and in Japan there are many military bases, American military bases, which we thought were bad things. And I thought mathematics, physics are great, but they didn't give me the means to understand the world that was taking place. So in the end, I just decided to do something different. And I had already been studying Russian, so that certainly helped me. And in the end, I decided to major in what they called regional studies, focused on Russia, and then started reading, all these, Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, and everything. In the end, I thought, yes, Soviet history was quite interesting, bloody, but interesting. Why was it such bloody, so full of terror? That question has been with me ever since.
Okay, we will move to this issue in a few minutes, but you have written on different aspects of the short 20th century, or different aspects of Soviet history, for example, first five-year plan, industrialization, personality of Stalin, history of Donbass, to name but a few. But it seems to me that the topic of terror and mass repressions occupies a special place in your works. Your last two books, The Voices of the Dead and The Conscience on Trial, were devoted to this topic. Yes, in these books you try to retrieve the voices of the people who were erased from the history by the Soviet authorities and NKVD, and I think it's very important. But I would like to ask you what the inquiries into the terror, the mass repressions of the Stalin's period could tell us about the Soviet society, about the mentality and consciousness of ordinary people who lived in Soviet Ukraine.
I think that's a fascinating question. Why am I interested in terror? I think terror is extraordinary. Terror takes place everywhere, even in a democratic society. But I came to realize that terror in the Soviet Union and then other communist countries. Certainly I was aware of what was happening in communist China, Mao Zedong, with Japan was so close. We sometimes listened to Beijing radio and propaganda broadcast. But we knew that people were being terrorized. There was no freedom there. So there are a number of questions that preoccupied me. One is why did the government terrorize people, particularly kill them? I'm going to discuss the Great Terror tomorrow, but there's so many people were simply killed. So many people put in jail and gulag. Why did Stalin have to do it? Why did he do it? So that is one of my preoccupations. On the other hand, the other question is people, the ordinary people, millions of people who lived through this bloody process. Of course, there are questions, why did they stand up? Well, they couldn't stand up for obvious reasons, because of terror. But how did they feel? Were they happy? I didn't think they were happy, but because of censorship, because the Soviet Union was a closed society, even though we read dissident literature, for example, still it was so darn difficult to understand what the ordinary people thought about their lives, about their leaders, about their country. So there are all kinds of methodological problems, but on the one hand, I really wanted to understand the leaders, particularly Stalin, and I ended up writing a short biography some time ago. But I was also very interested in presenting the lives of ordinary people, nameless people whose lives have been completely forgotten. And because after the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukrainian archives began to open up, much more so than the Russian archives. With great difficulty, I was able to have access to the files of those people, those Ukrainian individuals who were repressed. When I wrote that book on the Donbass, I was already able to have some access to some people repressed in the Donbass, in Luhansk and in Donetsk. And as I understand that these archives are either destroyed or taken away, so it would be terribly difficult to study the great terror in the Donbass now. But later on, Donbass was so far, it was so difficult to get there, life was difficult, Kiev was a little more comfortable, easy to come, so I decided to focus on Kiev, and I was able to have access to dozens of people who are repressed there. And I worked, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years, and wrote this book. I did not make grand analysis of Ukrainian society and the terror, but I just wanted to show how people lived. I wanted to recover the voices of people who just were killed and left no voices. There are people like, beggars, some aspiring ballerina, priests, teachers, just whose names no one remembers. And certainly Stalin said, who remembers these people? No one will remember. So I just wanted to recover the voices of these people. Of course it was very easy, but reading these files, almost all of them were handwritten, and sometimes several hundred pages. So I just sat, instead of taking Xerox copy and taking them to America and sit at home and read, no, I didn't do that. I just sat in the archives reading room, read each page from the beginning to the end, each page, not those printed pages, but handwritten notes, which wasn't easy, but in the end I got used to it. And I learned to read handwritten Russian, mainly Russian, but Ukrainian as well. And they wanted to analyze and try to recover some voices that might have been left in these files. And I think I was able to recover few voices. I did not expect to hear any of the relatives, because there aren't so many people, over 30 people or so, but I was pleased to hear from at least 2 relatives who ended up abroad. One family, there was a dentist in Arizona, United States, who read my book and said, oh, actually one of the Hungarian, no, I forgot, there, she is my aunt. I was so pleased to read about her, because we knew nothing about. Most of the family left, but she stayed, and then she finally found that her aunt was killed. There was another family from Australia, or maybe New Zealand, I forgot, New Zealand or Australia, whose relative is also described in this book. So I got at least maybe 3. So I was extremely pleased that I was able to contribute to those people whose relatives just disappeared from history completely. And there are tens of thousands of these documents in Kiev alone. And of course, in this area, it's terror start after Stalin comes in 1939, but in other parts of Ukraine, there are hundreds of thousands of these files. And if we could recover the voices of each of these people, that would be wonderful. But certainly I cannot do it. I've done this. I've done one more book. And now I'm going into many different directions. But I'm glad I was able to recover some of those people who disappeared, who were killed by Stalin and completely forgotten. So just that was my contribution to Ukrainian history.
Thank you. I think this is really important to retrieve these voices, to return them into history. But apart from writing this book on victims of the terror, you also wrote a biography of Stalin. And I would like to ask you about the role of Stalin in this terror. Whether it was Stalin who designed the totalitarian system with mass repression as its main element, or rather totalitarianism was inherent in the communist system and Stalin was just a function of this system.
Of course ideology mattered, of course the system mattered, but in many respects the system was created by Stalin. And there are many different forms of communism. Many were similar, and many has terror built in. Clearly, the leaders knew that without terror, their power might collapse. If not on its own, but with pressure from outside combined with pressure from below. So the terror was inherent in the system. And there is a great deal of similarity between Mao Zedong and Stalin. We can also add Pol Pot and others. But here, I think one of the most important conclusions is that, for these people interested in power, individuals' lives really don't matter. In these 2 years alone, on which I'm going to talk tomorrow, Stalin killed about 700,000 people. And this takes place in peacetime. Why? I don't think the death of these people really concerned. I don't think the death of these people concerned Stalin at all. If you look at communist China, Mao Zedong, it's a bloody event. We have Holodomor in Ukraine, it affected Galicia, of course, because Galicia was outside the Soviet Union. I don't think the death of individual people really didn't matter to him. What mattered is, of course, power. Power was the essence by which politicians live. So I have very strong distrust of politicians, all kinds of politicians, including politicians in democracy, in my own country, in America, and so on. There are degrees of difference in degree of mistrust. Certainly, dictators are less trustworthy, or far less trustworthy. So I shouldn't trust every politician. Nevertheless, politicians do live by power, not by money or something. Most politicians may also be interested in money and other things. But what distinguished Stalin is this. Stalin was extremely unique because it appeared that Stalin lived by politics alone. Nothing else really interested him. Money, sex, that sort of thing. No, many politicians fail because they are also tempted by sex and money and other things. But Stalin was very completely alien to these matters. And that is quite rare. In that sense, he was superb superb politician, bad politician, but superb, and also made some comparison between Stalin and Hitler. And Hitler is far inferior politician. He somehow got caught up in some racist ideas of the world, and he was not as disciplined as the Stalin, and there was no comparison. I can go on to discuss whether Stalin was a racist or not, but in order to understand a society like the Soviet Union, I understood very early on that we needed to understand the leader, structures, the system itself, as well as the ordinary people. And the understanding the ordinary people was, of course, is the most difficult part, and I've been struggling, and I've also written about how to understand the minds of ordinary people. Stalin was a little bit easier in that sense because we have more data than these particular individuals.
Okay, I think we can return to these issues of the totalitarian system and Soviet period into the Q&A session, but now I would like to propose to proceed to the contemporary situation and to the impact of this Soviet totalitarian legacy on today's Ukraine and Russia. And for example, if we look at Euromaidan and subsequent hybrid war between Ukraine and Russia in Donbass, we can see quite frequent references to the Soviet history on both sides of the conflict. I think the case of the so-called Leninapad is very characteristic in this regard. It exemplifies quite well the general stance of settling scores with, or rather denial of, the Soviet legacy. For the communization laws, which were passed by the Ukrainian parliament about 3 months ago, they tend to legalize this attitude. They condemn Soviet regime as criminal, they prohibit propaganda of Soviet ideology, and they require removing of monuments to Soviet leaders, renaming of streets, squares, cities, and so on. On the other hand, we can see quite different picture in today's Russia, where the authorities in fact initiated the rehabilitation of the Stalin, and where the myth, the Soviet myth of Great Patriotic War became a pillar of state ideology. My question is, what is the impact of this totalitarian legacy on today's Ukraine and Russia? Why we see these differences between two countries in dealing with this legacy? And what politics of dealing with the past should the authorities in Ukraine and Russia pursue in order to overcome the negative consequences of this totalitarian legacy?
Good question. I think many people talk about the legacy of the system of mentality, the way people, Russian people, Ukrainian people, and other former Soviet Union republics think about the world, about themselves. So there is a lot said about this, but I'd like to look at this from a different point of view. The Soviet Union was a basically closed society. Stalinist society was basically completely isolated from the other world. Post-Soviet, post-Stalin society was a little more open, but it was still very much closed communication with the outside world was very difficult. But that was already broken, basically, wasn't it? Basically now, well, Russia may still be restricted to one extent or another, but southern Ukraine is completely open. So here I like to answer, this is just one point, but I think the biggest problem, the way I see today, tomorrow I may have a different opinion, but is the fact that it restricted the development of resources, human, material, and other resources of the Soviet Union, including Soviet Ukraine. Now we have open society. We can go anywhere, study, work, well, working, these are other issues that are there, but simply we do not have enough resources here. Material, mainly I think material resources. If you go, if you do want to do something, you need money, you need resources. If you want to go to, say, to go to America and study, you need maintenance, incredibly, you need an enormous amount of money. If you can do it, you can study there, or you can study in England or whatever for a year, then come back, or stay there, come back and do something. So even though it's open society, internet is available, you can communicate with otherwise, still there is a bit of closeness here. Now, if the Soviet Union had developed differently, if Russia, Ukraine, Poland had developed differently, these sort of restrictions, which are not imposed by any society, any state, any power, but simply the society does not own enough resources for individuals to develop their individual capacity, develop the capacity of society. And that seems to be weighing very hard on Ukraine and also other former Soviet Union countries. Now, we all often talk about mentality, we talk about Soviet mentality. There is even a word for that, Sobok, yes? In a sense, yes, but human minds has boundless, say no, there's no really border to human minds. You can read literature, you can talk to people, you can imagine many things. Of course, these material resources that constrain your activity may indeed limit your imagination. But even the poorest countries produce excellent writers, for example, excellent poems. So human mind is really boundless. And I didn't, today, at least today, I now feel that when we all talk about mentality, Soviet legacy of Soviet mentality, we may be just making an excuse that we have to live within such tight material constraints, resource constraints, which we cannot do anything about until society as a whole develop and become wealthier. That seems to me now, I feel that it seems to be the most important legacy of the Soviet system, which sort of stunted the growth of national wealth in the Soviet Union, including Ukraine. Could have developed, much more rapidly. It could have been as well off as many other countries, but I think somehow something. In other words, the Soviet system itself restricted the development of national wealth, and that seems to have a strong impact on the possibilities of the development of each individual in a given society, including Ukraine.
But I agree with you that surely this issue of the loss of the resources is very important. But I think, for example, in Russia the situation is much better than, for example, in Ukraine, due to the natural resources which Russia has. However, we see rather retardation in the development of the democratic institutions, civil society in Russia in comparison with Ukraine. So why this takes place? Why we see these differences between Ukraine and Russia, for example? And what should authorities do? How should they pursue in dealing with this past? Whether do you think that the approach taken recently by current Ukrainian government is adequate?
Good question, but difficult question. But I would say this. Russia may be materially better off. How better off? I can't tell. There are statistics, of course. They may be better off, but their long-term, prospect may not be so good if Putin is there. Given the poll that shows most Russians are supporting Putin, which may be true, may not be true, Russia seems to be going anachronistic. They seem to be going back to whatever glory the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire may have had. No, that's a very retrogressive move. In comparison, Ukraine, which may be materially poorer, seems to be doing far better. This is a much more open society, much freer. I can say anything I want, and I don't think the Ukrainian government would put me in jail. But that's not the case in Moscow. If I say something inflammatory, well, I might be in trouble. Certainly I can get all kinds of documents I want as a historian. Moreover, Russia's autocratic tradition seems to be difficult to eliminate. Until 1989, Russia had only one free election in the entire history. That is 1917, the Constituent Assembly elections. After that, what's happening? We certainly hoped and believed that Russia would become more democratic. Now it seems to be going back to the old mode. Although I would say that Putin is not Stalin, and today's Russia is not the Soviet Union. So yeah, Putin cannot isolate Russia. So Putin would have a problem. In comparison, Ukraine may be chaotic. Ukraine's military forces may not be as strong as Russia, and in the battlefield, being weak is a problem. Nevertheless, I think we have more freedom here. We are exploring Ukraine is exploring its possibility more freely and openly, and this is an incredibly important strength. Ukraine doesn't have autocratic traditions, correct? I don't think maybe some nostalgia about stability that might have existed under the Soviet Union, but Ukraine doesn't share that sort of autocratic tradition Russia seems to be fond of. And that is an incredible advantage Ukraine has, and you should be proud of it, I think. Otherwise, I think it's bad to think that we are weaker than Russia. We cannot cope with Russia. No, that's defeatist attitude. It is bad. I think Ukraine may be poorer, but the future is brighter That is my impression of these two countries.
Thank you very much. I think on this optimistic statement we can open the floor for the questions from the audience. Дуже прошу ставити ваші питання до професора Куромії, якось можна прокоментувати те, що ви вже говорили, або, власне, задати якесь питання, якого ми ще навіть не торкалися.
Maybe you can ask a question that we have not touched upon yet. So are there any volunteers? So the microphone is here. Please ask your questions in the microphone. But I will ask my question in Ukrainian. By educational background, I am an artist and cultural studies expert. I've studied in Kyiv and Lviv. My name is Darya Bazilevich. And I have the following question to you. You've been in Ukraine for several days. Have you been to Kyiv during your stay in Ukraine now? And what is your impression of the current condition of our society? So as far as I understand, you have been researching the totalitarian society in the Soviet Union. And can you say that maybe now the Ukrainian society is in this deep provincial chasm? Maybe we can compare our society with Montenegro, because Montenegro also claims to be an EU member state. So can you draw any parallels, maybe in particular in the area of medicine, law? We have not really become a new normal society yet. You might know that corruption is prospering here. The level of crime is quite high. And there are a lot of people whose psychological activities are an inseparable part of this corruption and crime. And it's been a year since the Euromaidan, but not a lot has changed in Ukraine. And our healthcare officials continue trading in various medicines as part of the shadow economy. So crime is prospering and the situation is even worse than before. So can you observe any change?
I understood the question. Now it's working. Sure, there are lots of problems, and Ukraine's problems are serious, and I understand how frustrating the whole thing. There are a great deal of distrust in the government, and most importantly, the failure of the Orange Revolution. That really difficult to accept for people, particularly for the people of Ukraine. So I understand, and there are all kinds of divisions, as you said. Ukraine doesn't seem to be able to control the corruption. It doesn't seem to be able to mobilize the entire country, cannot unify it. So yes, there are all kinds of problems. I understand your frustration. But for the moment, I think the most important thing is, of course, Russia's aggression. But I would say this: Ukraine is a very young country. It's only 24 years old. So there will be a lot of problems. But this is a terribly exciting process, I think, painful. But you are going to create a new, prosperous country. And I always look at the United States. The United States started at a very good time. All the resources came from Europe and so on. But look at the US history. 70 years after the country was founded, they had terrible civil war. It divided. Civil war, yes, over slave treatment of blacks and others. They killed so many people. It's the largest casualty in the history of the United States, 600,000 people. And then yesterday, I just read a report that a white man killed 9 black men. He was clearly racist. And this is South Carolina, which still hosts a Confederate flag, which is a flag of the Southern Confederate, which fought against the northern part of the United States. That was Civil War, that decades after the United States was founded. Now this fall in the Donbass, this is 5 years after. So there will be problems, there will be all kinds of issues. I'm afraid. That seems to be inevitable. And yes, a few days ago I discussed the problem of the Donbass. United States is a country of freedom. But freedom is also quite restricted in the sense that if you're black, that is certainly a problem. I'm not sort of criticizing the United States, but that is a fact of life. So, questions of freedom, democracy, equality, prosperity, all these things are an extremely complex issue. And, European countries, American may look ideal in many respects, but they have also all kinds of problems, divisions, internal fightings, and corruption. Yes. The only difference I see is that over centuries in Europe, in America, they certainly built a legal structure, institutional structure, which restricts unlimited power, which controls the behavior of everyone, including the Prime Minister, President, businessman, and so on. So, yes, there are mechanisms built in to restrict extreme manifestation of power, greed, corruption, and so on, which that sort of mechanism is still being created in this country. That's why we have all these problems and we get frustrated. But I think if we stay patient, we cannot build a stable, prosperous society overnight. And I think it's going to be painful. But I think the best thing now for Ukraine is that the outside world doesn't trust Russia for what Russia is doing. So they are behind Ukraine. And that support, it really has to be taken advantage of. And if you lose that support, then Ukraine will be a real problem. But the support is there. So yes, for all the problems, for all the frustration you may have, I think Ukraine is not in a bad state right now. I'm hopeful in that sense. I'm very optimistic.
Дякуємо.
Thank you very much. There's another question from the audience.
Thank you very much for your inspiring talk. My name is Natalia Las, and I would like to ask you 2 questions. So the first question is about the role that American academic experts in Eurasian region play in shaping American policy towards this region, towards Russia, Ukraine, and so on. So, for example, we have 2 examples. The one is the activity of the public activity of Timothy Snyder, Sergei Plokhy, who are very active, who are in these public talks and so on. But my impression is that people from the American academia who are experts in Ukraine are not active enough. And we still have a place for such people like Stephen Cohen, who is a sort of self-appointed expert in Ukraine, but we know that he doesn't speak Ukrainian, he has never been in Ukraine, and so on. So my question is about why don't American experts want to play such active role? Are they afraid to be of some kind of cold warriors, which was the case in the Cold War? And my second question is about, so to say, a new Ukrainian studies, because my impression is that a dubious role of such public intellectuals and experts in this region And the idea that expert in Russia can be easily converted into expert in Ukraine. This idea is a little bit corrupted, and probably we need some kind of new Ukrainian studies in the US, which may be separated from, so to say, Eurasian studies or Russian studies or Soviet studies and so on. Thank you.
Yes, the first question. US is an interesting country where intellectuality is not particularly highly regarded. It's very different from Europe and other places where professor status is very high. But in America, not really. It's lawyers and businessmen that control the world. Academics are consulted, but I don't think they have much power. So Professor Snyder's, Professor Blohi, they appear and they may be consulted, but they do not directly make contribution to policy making. Professor Cohen, whom I know well because he was a professor at my university. I took his course. And why he said such nonsense, I shouldn't criticize my own professor, but I'm old enough to say whatever I want, I think. And even when I was a grad student, I often disagree with him because he idealized Bukhari in the so I thought, not such a significant figure. We disagreed. Why? Certainly he befriended Gorbachev, and he seemed to. Certainly he doesn't understand the Ukraine at all. I don't think he never studied the Ukrainian history, but somehow he comes to the side of Russia from a probably realistic point of view. What else ideological reason he has, I don't know, except that he is an American left. And, as I said, America has all kinds of problems. So we intellectuals criticize American policy. America is no saint. So yeah, but criticizing the United States shouldn't mean supporting Russia. And that line may not be always clear. But as far as I'm concerned, I think the intellectual's role is telling the truth, however inconvenient that may be. So certainly I'm not trusted by any government. The Japanese government doesn't trust me because I criticize the Japanese government, the United States government. God knows what they think, but I'm sure they have huge files on me. So, yes, the privilege is telling the truth. So we do not contribute directly to policy formations, which is basically done by foreign experts in the State Department and so on. But I do think that they do consult some academics, CIA, State Department, and so on. But I'm not quite sure whether there is any direct impact on policy making, because policy makers often don't like truth. That's one question. The second question is, yes, it's true. Ukraine, except for legacy historians, Ukraine did not have a very legitimate status in the study of Soviet and East European studies. They tended to dismiss Ukrainian studies as Cold War emigre studies, which lacked, in their thinking, objectivity. And of course, Ukraine has been affected by Russia to such an extent that Russian language is dominant, perhaps except in Western Ukraine, and that gives the specialists a sense that if you are a Russian specialist, you can comment on Ukraine, which is not true. Ukraine has very, complex history. And I can tell you, some of my colleagues who are Russian specialists are mobilized to teach current situation. They know nothing about Ukraine. I have to quote them sometimes. But of course, this fact is not realized by specialists or by Russian specialists. They think they can comment on it, but certainly they don't know basic things about Ukrainian history. But the problem is that non-heritage Ukrainian specialists aren't many. I'm neither Russian nor Ukrainian, so on. So probably I think I'm very objective. But most specialists of Ukraine, with few exceptions, are of Ukrainian origin, which by default makes them appear a little suspect. Whereas in the field of Russian studies, in America, in Europe, the heritage students, in other words, people of Russian origin, is a minority. The majority of them are those who, just normal people with no family ties to the former Soviet Union and so on. So yes, they claim that they are objective. But I think things are changing. Now most people know that Ukraine is much better for research. Ukraine is not like Russia. And more people are coming to Ukraine to study Ukraine and Soviet history seriously. And as far as I'm concerned, I was able to write all these big books because Ukraine was open. I couldn't have written anything like that if I had worked in Russia alone. I was fortunate enough to sort of taught myself Ukrainian when I was still in Japan. No, there was no course of Ukrainian in Japan at that time, but I certainly taught myself to read. And so, I was able to read all kinds of sources in Russian, Ukrainian, and so on. So maybe I'm a bit of an exception, and I'm always sympathetic to a smaller, weaker nations. And I knew that Russia, Soviet Union is extremely imperialistic, and I think the age of empire is over. And Japan was also imperialistic, inflicted all kinds of problems on Asia. So I had that feeling that you cannot do that to other nations, other peoples who don't like being dominated by powerful nations. But Russia's people, why people do not properly understand Russia-Ukraine? Yes, certainly most people have not taken Ukraine seriously. A small country, not very different from Russia, therefore no need to study it carefully. Another factor is, of course, completely selfish, and no one wants to talk about it. But that is their American academics' fear of being denied the entry visa to Russia and being denied access to the archives that might cut their professional life. So they don't say so to me, but it's very clear that they are afraid of that, because it's not free country. I don't care. If I cannot go there, I can go other places. Here, Poland, there are many places. So it doesn't give me any problem, but there are many people who are afraid of Russia. So they don't want to go out and criticize Russia, which is bad. That's not what academics should do. They should tell the truth. But there are these factors which they never tell. But they are there in their minds.
Дякуємо. Ще питання.
Thank you. More questions, please? Thank you. My name is Petr Dominovsky. I was born and grew up in Donetsk. First of all, a comment on how the world is more supportive of Ukraine than of Russia. I was actually surprised by a study, by research of a journalist that I know. She did an analysis of foreign press, let's say Reuters, what sort of news they talk about from Ukraine and about from Russia. So from Ukraine, they were talking about the front line, the fighting, the fire at Kyiv, various other things, scary things. In Russia, the news was the opening of a museum in Moscow, and a strange thing, somewhere in Russia, somewhere in the Russian province, they built a helicopter with a helicopter of horse sausage, and this was a news story on Reuters. I mean, look, these things are like, for instance, what is happening now is also happening. I mean, it's better than some helicopter from horse meat, but Western media are not interested in covering these stories. So this is the one comment. But the question that I had as to, you mentioned ordinary people. You mentioned this in the beginning, and their sense, how they felt. And I'm interested now, when the war ends and Ukraine wins, what do we do with these ordinary people in the Donbass who, deluded or fooled, whether for selfish motives or perhaps for selfish motives, supported the idea, this idea of fighting against Ukraine, of this pro-Russian ideas, fighting against the Ukrainian junta, right? So it seems to me that these processes have to be similar to the processes of the denazification of Nazi Germany, and I don't know, possibly what happened in Japan after the Second World War, because Japan was also very, sort of paranoid. All of these are enemies, and then suddenly everybody's a friend. How did this happen? And do you see this parallel? And perhaps you have something to suggest in this light.
Thank you. Yes, as far as Japan is concerned, yes, sort of, many people are sort of kicked out of official jobs. They were not allowed to take official positions after World War II. But then when the Cold War ended, American policy suddenly loosened, and those people who should have been tried as war criminals came back to politics. And that's why Japan still has a great deal of problem dealing with World War II crimes Japan has committed. So it was a pity. It was a pity, but that is the case. Now, as far as Ukraine is concerned, when the war ends and Ukraine wins, and I think it will, I don't know about Crimea, what will happen to Crimea, but the Donbass will stay, I hope, and I think it will stay. I don't think Russia wants the Donbass, and the republics cannot survive without Russia. So I think the chances are good that Ukraine will keep the Donbass. But then the question arises, crime and punishment. They committed a crime. So whom and how is Ukraine going to punish? But of course, in order to live together, there has to be also the process of forgiveness and reconciliation. And each country has to deal with the question, and not everyone succeeds. There are all kinds of problems. So I don't have any prescription. Ukrainian government, Ukrainian people have to find ways to settle this question to their satisfaction, not to the satisfaction of everyone, but to the satisfaction of many people. There are many other questions we simply have not dealt with. And 2 days ago, when I gave a talk at the City Hall, I mentioned the Volhynia massacre of 1943-44. In that massacre, probably more than 100,000 Poles and Ukrainians were killed. An incredible scale of killings. How did we deal with? How did Poles deal with? You see, nevertheless, so no, we haven't dealt with the question properly, but still now Poland and Ukraine get along. They try to work together, live together, try to prosper together. So there are problems, but that may not prevent Ukraine from going forward. I think this is an ongoing process. It may take 50 years, it may take 100 years, but how to do it, how quickly, there is no prescription on my part, no, but yes, it will be a serious and important question, but each society has to find ways to deal with it.
Thank you. Прошу, Тетяна Жорженко.
Тетяна Жорженко had a question? No, behind.
Professor Kuromiya, you were talking about the short 20th century in your introductory remarks, and I wanted to ask you, now it has become a commonplace to speak about the new Cold War. And the Russian leadership openly says that what happened in 1991, they want to play it back, so to say, that everything went wrong in 1991, and we kind of feel that what's going on now, that actually Soviet Union did not die completely in 1991. So how does it affect history writing? And is it really so that the 20th century ended in 1991?
Thank you. I do think it ended. If you look at the modern history, since the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, it's basically the competition of the 2-3 main ideas. One is capitalism, the other one is anti-capitalism in the form of socialism. So these two main ideologies competed. We have to consider nationalism too, but nationalism can be capitalistic or socialistic. But these two main ideological trends in the modern world competed for nearly 2 centuries, and then the idea of socialism, communism was realized in the form of the Soviet Union, and then in China and others. But that experiment failed. Now, that doesn't mean that socialism would disappear, communism would disappear. Ideas will continue, experiments will continue. But that grand attempt to create socialist, communist state failed. And then no one really is building any. Cuba is not doing well, China, or was it socialism? It's a sort of state capitalism controlled by the Communist Party, which doesn't want the Chinese people to read Marx. What kind of communism is that? So in that sense, that great competition between socialism and capitalism ended. Now this may not be the final end, there will be another, ideological competition, contentions, but in that sense I think, yes, the short 20th century ended. Now, Tanya, yes, it's absolutely right that the Soviet Union didn't just collapse, the empire is still there. Look at Russia. It's still a huge country, so many different nationalities. Who may want to become independent? I don't know. Volga Tatars, Chechens, Dagestanis, maybe Buryats, and so on. There are so many nationalities there. And certainly Chechens fought war, and Putin, they have not succeeded. But if Russians now say that that was a disaster or that should not have happened, they are absolutely wrong. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed not because all these other countries wanted to become independent. Kravchuk, for example, the first president, when that coup of August 1991 took place, I'm not quite sure where Kravchuk stood. When the coup failed, he suddenly became the supporter of Ukrainian independence. But the way the Soviet Union collapsed was that Russia wanted to become independent of the Soviet Union. Russia's position was that Russia, they thought they would be better off without Ukraine or Georgia or all these other republics who seemed to, need help from Russia all the time. So their position, Russia's position was that we would be better off without Ukraine, without Georgia and so on. And the Ukrainians thought the same. Maybe we have been exploited by Russia so long that we would be better off without Russia, right? I think that's the sentiment. Okay, we believe that independent Ukraine will make us better. Will make Ukraine more prosperous? Well, it turned out to be that things are much more complex. But Russians wanted to become independent. Ukraine became independent, wanted to become independent. This was amicable divorce. Now I think Russians are trying to change that history. So we have to remind them that Yeltsin wanted to destroy the Soviet Union, when Yeltsin wanted to have Russia become independent. And Ukraine and many other countries wanted the same. Ukraine wanted to become independent. And this was amicable, no fighting, really. So Russia, if they think that 1991 was a disaster, is falsifying history. Bad memory, wrong memory.
Дякуємо.
Thank you very much. I think we have enough time for about 2 more questions. You wanted to ask a question? You're welcome.
My question is about love to freedom. In Freedom and Terror in Donbass, you wrote that people from Donbass loved freedom very much, but didn't want any authority over them. So it seems like, if I understand it correctly, there's like 2 sorts of love to freedom. One is positive, when you recognize human rights, when you're obedient to power, and another is kind of that negative love to freedom, then you just disrupt any power, any rule which comes over you, because you love this freedom so much, and probably this starts already from Kazakhs, and if I understand correctly. So do you think that there is a place for theory of bad love to freedom? Because a theory about positive love to freedom, this is basically theory of democracy. But is such theory about bad love to freedom, disruptive love to freedom possible? Do you see such possibility?
Thank you. Yes, we may have to go into some philosophical discussion, but yes, I did use the concept of negative freedom, freedom from, which was translated into Ukrainian "svoboda від", as opposed to "svoboda для", as a positive freedom. So what characterizes Donbass historically is this desire for freedom from negative freedom. That's true. Whether they had positive freedom, whether they wanted to do whatever they want, well, that is not entirely separate from freedom but they had this sense of exit, freeing from control by the outside world. And if we look at the history of the Donbass, yeah, that's certainly true. That is certainly true. But that ended basically in 1991, when they chose to become part of the of independent Ukraine. And if Ukraine became free and freer, the Donbass function is no longer there. The Donbass function as a place of exit, place to seek freedom from, basically ended. That changed the situation very much. But freedom is a very tricky concept, and living in the United States, I can say very clearly about it. They have different kinds of problems, but it's country freedom. I think all country agrees. But there are of course always problems. Freedom, country of freedom, had extremely strong history of slavery. Until 1861, it was abolished, but blacks did not have civil rights until the 1960s. It's quite recently. It's harder to believe. It's incredibly hard to believe. I discussed this with my own family, who are Americans. Of course they were embarrassed, but they seem to have had no problem. Those political theorists, politicians, and some of the American founding fathers, including George Washington, had slaves. Even now, yes, they think that they have freedom to own guns. Because I may sound extremely critical of the United States, but that's okay. They cannot kick me out. I can say if I want, because I think that's my right, even though I'm not an American citizen. And then, of course, as I said yesterday, there was this report of a white supremacist boy who is only 21 or 22, went to a black church in South Carolina and killed 9 people. What kind of freedom is that? They still hoist the Confederate flag, which supported slavery. So yes, this question of freedom in the freest country in the world had all kinds of problems. So I understand that people, the Donbass, it may have been a place of freedom, but of course they have all kinds of problems dealing with the question. They may not want to be controlled by other outside powers, but at the same time, as the Cossacks did, these freedom lovers always had practical alliance with other groups in order to protect their freedom. So it's a very complex history, and my abstraction, generalization of freedom does have some problems. It doesn't explain everything, but I thought it explained certain aspects of why the Donbass has been such a problem place. So I'm sorry I cannot explain everything, but that's my answer.
I just want to briefly add something that Professor Kuromiya has not mentioned. Such a theory already exists. This theory, this distinction between freedom from and freedom to, Totalitarian, he dedicated a lot of works to the notion of freedom. And we have enough time just for one more question. You're welcome.
Thank you very much. And if my question is the last one, so I will pose a traditional question. What are your plans for the future? So what do you plan to study? And to put this question more broadly, how do you see the perspectives of Soviet studies and especially studies of the Stalinist period? Because we know that so many studies were already done and so many books were written, and we had totalitarian school, then more revisionist approaches, and later mostly like cultural studies approaches were introduced into Soviet studies. And what topics and what new approaches, maybe methodological approaches, do you expect to become important in the future, and what are your personal research plans?
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, I'm a professor and teach Russian, Soviet, Ukrainian, also Eurasian history. And I train graduate students, so yes, I'm familiar with all these trends, new trends. But I tend to be very critical. If I go into details, to be extremely long, and I may not be able to explain everything. But maybe just a few words I'd like to say. Regarding the American studies, European studies of the Soviet Union, I'm afraid there are all kinds of interesting works being written, being published, but in one critical respects, most of them miss a big picture, which is the secrecy that has been kept in the history of the Soviet Union. Russian Empire, the history of Russian Empire is relatively open because basically they opened all the archives, including Ukraina and Soviet Russian secret police. So we not understand what the Russian secret police did. But what we don't know about the Soviet history is the secret activities the Soviet government had carried out in the Soviet Union and particularly outside the Soviet Union. We know bits and pieces what kind of secret agents had been working in various countries, what kind of secret operations Kuomintang carried out. All kinds of problems there. And the most critical issue for me, which I'd like to say to my colleagues, is that they may not be aware of these problems. Because Moscow very strictly controlled data on these matters. They still do. They still hide so many documents that I can tell. Because in Moscow, they don't give me what I want. Because they don't want to show anything. However, this is related to what I'm doing now. Of course, I'll keep reading on the Donbass. I probably will come back to Ukraine because Ukrainian archives are now much more open. And even when I worked in Kiev, Ukraine, some years ago, so I'll come back. But I've been also working in other archives, particularly in Poland and in Japan. And then last week I was in Mongolia, where you can get documents you cannot get in Moscow. And then because Japan and Poland worked together closely against the Soviet Union until 1941, we have a great deal of interesting documents about what they did and what the Soviets did. And in Mongolia's case, yes, Mongolia was the first Soviet satellite state. They did all kinds of nasty things there, experimented, and they used that the experience, applied it to Eastern Europe after World War II, when the Soviet Union occupied Eastern Europe. So what the Soviet Union did is dreadful. And I wrote a short piece in some blog site in Ukraine Today TV site. Hybrid war, for example, we are talking about in Eastern Ukraine, nothing new. Stalin practiced it. Stalin practiced it not in Europe, because Europe is open, he couldn't do it. What did Stalin do? He did it in Asia, in Mongolia, and in China, particularly in Western China, called the Xinjiang, it's a Muslim area. They disguised their own soldiers as Chinese soldiers, sent them, and then fought against the Chinese rebels. Controlled Mongolia as a colony, where in the 1930s they killed about 3% of the population. That would have been about 4 million people in the Soviet Union. In other words, the Great Terror in Mongolia was far more intense than the Great Terror in the Soviet Union. No one talks about it. None of my colleagues talk about it. They don't talk about it. I do, because I worked in these other archives, because I do know that in Moscow I cannot get hold of them. They deny me. But from Polish sources, Japanese sources, and also a lot of good Chinese sources, published sources, I gained these pieces of information, and now picture is becoming very clear. For example, I'm sure almost all of you, without exception, think that the Battle of Lake Hassan, 1938, between Japan and the Soviet Union, and the Kharkin Gold Battle between Japan and the Soviet Union, involving Manchukuo and the Mongolians in 1939, were provoked by Japan. all textbooks, all books, without single exception, as far as I could tell, say that it was Japanese, they were Japanese provocations. And I thought so. And Japan did all kinds of things. But I looked at all these important documents in various archives, and now it's clear to me that the Soviets provoked them. I have clear evidence on Lake Hassan, and then I have very strong evidence on Harukin Gorbachev. So if these are true, it really, changes the history of not only Soviet history, but the history of the world. So in this sense, I'd like to do something new because I have no hope that in the near future we can get hold of the most important documents in Moscow. But if Ukraine opens up everything, and almost everything is open in Poland, Mongolia, and so on, then perhaps we can find a great deal more without access to the archives Moscow is hiding. So this is what I'm doing. In other words, trying to understand Soviet desire to control the world affairs, not only in Europe, about which we know relatively better, but also in Asia, which we know very little about, for obvious reasons, linguistic issues and others, and then combine what we know about what the Soviet Union did in Asia and in Europe, and see what the strategy of Moscow had been afterward. And I tell this to all my American students, just as the United States is both Atlantic and Pacific power. The United States is operating not only in Europe, in the Atlantic world, but the United States is incredible presence in the Pacific world too. Just like the United States, the Soviet Union, Russia, was both a European and Asian power. And if we exclude the Asian part, we may misunderstand Russia and the Soviet Union. So, coming from Asia, I come to realize that that is something I should do, because most other people can't do, and fortunately I can do so. That's what I like to do. But there are many other issues. I'd like to continue to work on the Donbass and so on. But I'm getting older, and time is limited, and I wish I had more time, but I cannot do everything. But I hope to train some younger people, and advise younger people, and encourage them to do things that no one has done. That may not have answered your question, but that's what I like to do.
Дуже дякую, пане професоре.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for these very detailed and very perceptive answers to these questions. I thank you all for being here. I thank you all for participating and for commenting, for asking questions. I would like to thank our volunteers who've helped us organize these events. And in conclusion, I'd just like to make a few announcements that may be interesting, may be of interest to you. Our festival continues, and the events as part of this lecture and discussion program also continue. And tomorrow we'll have another lecture by Professor Kuromiya. This is going to be the last one as part of his visit here in Lviv. At 1:30, same place, here at the Center for Urban History, there'll be a lecture on why mass murder, Stalin, the Donbass, and the Great Terror, where we will talk more about, or the professor will tell us more about the terror of the 1930s, about how it was organized, what the role of Stalin was, and with a special emphasis on how it all happened in the Donbass. for me, it was a really big. I was really surprised to learn when, as in reading Professor Kuromiya's book on the Donbass, it was a big surprise for me to learn what the importance of violence was. You know, everybody was talking about this negative freedom today as an important element in the history of the Donbass, but how important was the role of this violence and terror in the history of this region, and to what extent what we see today is a repetition of what had already happened, both in imperial times and even more so, even to a larger extent, in the Soviet times. So tomorrow we'll be talking about, touching upon this to a greater extent. This is going to happen tomorrow here at 1:30. And another small announcement for those interested in the problems of history, of the use of history, of memory in the modern day. You're invited on Monday, the 22nd, at the Ukrainian Catholic University. They'll have a seminar and a discussion with Professor Daniel Walkowitz from the New York University on who owns the past, public history in the USA. This will take place at 2 p.m. and participating in the discussion will be Sofia Dyak, director here at the Center for Urban History, and myself. So those of you who have the time and the interest, you can show up. It's at Kozelnitska 2 at the Humanities Department for the UKU. There's an announcement at the website of the Center for Urban History. Again, thank you very much and goodbye.